In this video, we are going to analyze an arms race game, right? And we're going to look at the outcome, the Nash equilibrium, where actually two countries are going to have a dominant strategy to both build nukes. And this is going to be an example of the prisoner's dilemma, right? Because it would actually be better off for both of these countries if they did not build nukes, even though they both have a dominant strategy to build nukes, right? So here's the game, right? So we see the row player is the Soviet Union, right, the USSR, and the column player is the United States, the US, right? And each country has two strategies, right? They can either not build or build, right? So the USSR can not build, the top row, or they could build nuclear weapons, which would be the bottom row. And then the US could decide to not build nuclear weapons, or they can decide to build, right? On the left, we have not build, and build is on the right. Okay, and we see that both countries would be pretty well off if they decided not to build, right? If there were no nuclear weapons between the two countries, they would both be pretty good. They would both get a payoff of 3, right? Whatever it happens to be, maybe utils or whatever. But their payoff is 3 here. But even though that seems like it's a pretty good outcome, it's actually the maximum total outcome, right? Here it's 3, here it's 5, 5, and 4. So it's a maximum total outcome. But despite the fact that the joint payoffs are highest when they both choose to not build, both of these countries actually have an incentive to build nuclear weapons, right? So despite that, they want to build nuclear weapons. And it's best to see this by just thinking about one country at a time. And so imagine, okay, if the US decides to not build, well, what would the USSR rather do? Well, notice that they actually get a higher payoff if they decide to build as well, right? They get a higher payoff if they decide to build while the US doesn't build. But it's also true, notice, that the USSR would be better off if they decide to build, even if the United States builds, right? So regardless of what the United States does, the USSR gets a higher payoff if they build nuclear weapons. And what that means is that building a nuclear weapon is a dominant strategy for the USSR, for the Soviet Union, right? Okay, so since that's a dominant strategy, that means that, well, that's sort of what they should do in order to maximize their own payout, right? So the USSR has a dominant strategy to build. The game is symmetric, so it better be the case the United States wants to build as well, or has a dominant strategy to build as well. And indeed, if you look, yes, the building gets the US 4 versus 3 if the Soviet Union decides to not build. Also, the United States gets 2 versus 1 if it decides to build rather than not build if the Soviet Union builds, right? So yes, for the United States, regardless of what the USSR does, they get a higher payoff if they build, right? So that means that the US and the USSR both have dominant strategies to build, and when both when both countries have when both players, regardless of the game, have a dominant strategy, then where those dominant strategies meet, that would actually be a Nash equilibrium, right? It's not the only place they can have a Nash equilibrium, but when that happens, that is a Nash equilibrium. And so that means that this outcome here, where they both build nuclear weapons, that is a Nash equilibrium, right? So nuclear proliferation is actually a Nash equilibrium, right? And the prisoner's dilemma comes from the fact that, well, yeah, they would end up in this world here where they both have nuclear weapons and they both get 2, payoffs of 2. They would both rather be here in the world where they don't build nuclear weapons, right? But since they can't they can't have a contract that's enforceable where they decide to do that, they're not going to be able to end up in that world. And that's one reason why we've had nuclear proliferation, is because in terms of foreign policy, you have more power if you have nuclear weapons. And so even if the other countries are not building, you have an incentive to build. And if they build as well, then you might as well build too. So we see that it's a prisoner's dilemma, that the Nash equilibrium is down here, where both countries build nuclear weapons. All right. Thank you for watching.